Now, he's been a regular contributor to the Times and the Guardian newspapers and has written on everything from atheism to the attack on civil liberties.
But recently, Viral History had great pleasure in talking to Professor A.C. Grayling about the Age of Enlightenment. A.C. Grayling, great pleasure to talk to you for Viral History. Your book, The Age of Genius, is about the 17th century intellectual revolution, a time when people stopped looking to God for answers and started asking those same questions of science. Do you think this was because of or despite the tumultuous times that people were living in?
In fact, a bit of both, really. The run-up to the 17th century intellectual revolution is, of course, the background of the Reformation in the 16th century. What that effectively did was to divide Europe into a domain where the Church, now the Roman Catholic Church, still exercised a tremendous degree of control over what people were allowed to think, what they were allowed to learn, what they were allowed to say. Whereas in the Protestant parts of Europe, there was no comparable control. And so there was a great efflorescence, a great outburst, really, of thinking about alchemy and magic and the Kabbalah and Hermeticism. And it was out of this tumult of inquiry and discussion that some people in the early 17th century, and two principal figures in particular, Descartes and Francis Bacon, recognized that in order to separate the wheat from the chaff here, to separate out chemistry from alchemy, astronomy from astrology, medicine from magic, what they had to do was they had to find the right kind of method. So one of the key moments in the intellectual revolution really is the thinking that went on about how you conduct inquiry. Bacon was very, very significant here because, of course, he argued that the empirical approach, observation and the application of reason, was cited as an inspiration by the founders of the Royal Society of London, and when they got their Royal Charter in 1662. And he said, not merely is it a case of looking at nature, but go to the people who deal with nature. Go to the farmers and the carpenters and the miners and the shipwrights and ask them about how matter, material things behave when, as he put it, they're being vexed. So you learn a great deal about the world from observation, and that was the key aspect of the empirical method that he urged.
Did the struggle between science and religion define that period? And if it's still ongoing, what's happened in between?
Yes, the struggle between science and religion was a key issue at the time. And one has to remember that Giordano Bruno, Cesare Vanini were burned at the stake in the early years of the 17th century because they had publicly avowed their belief that the Copernican view of the universe was correct. Galileo's trial in the early 1630s in Rome, where he had to recant his view that the earth moves and flies around the sun, was actually the last throw of the dice from the point of view of the church's effort to hold the line against the advance of science by force. But as you know, it was only acknowledged by the church, by the Vatican, in the 1990s that they had wronged Galileo. And the view that was being contested in the 17th century by scientists, that the earth is at the center of the universe, that the universe is very young, that the religious view about the nature and destiny of man in the universe is the correct one. That view was the one that was being effectively challenged in the 17th century. So even though today the great majority of people still think as people thought before the 17th century, nevertheless, whereas their view was the dominant view before that time, it is now, from a functional point of view, not from a numbers point of view, but from a functional point of view, it is the marginal view, the minority view. Because our world is now a world of laptops and aeroplanes and technology and the rest, which of course came out of the scientific revolution.
And during this time, how dangerous was it to admit your atheism?
I think it remained dangerous to avow atheism right up until the second half of the 19th century. Dangerous because in the 16th and early 17th century you could be put to death for it. Dangerous until the second half of the 19th century because you could be subjected to social exclusion and being sent to Coventry, being blocked from taking any active part really in the life of society because it was regarded with particular horror. In the 18th century there were plenty of people who were actually atheists, but they described themselves as deists, either to sort of cover their tracks a bit, or because until the 19th and 20th centuries, the great puzzle about origins, where did the universe come from, how did it get started, where did life come from, how did it get started, there were just no possible answers to those questions. Neither cosmology nor physics nor the biological sciences had begun to suggest answers. And so people thought there might have been some agency that got things going, and then that agency disappeared or lost interest or something. That was the deistic view of people like Voltaire and many others. But in practice, they were atheists.
You're quoted as saying that Christianity suppresses heritage. What did you mean by that?
Well, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era, it didn't take it very long, really not much more than a century after that, to suppress what they regarded as the pagan schools. So, for example, the great academies that had been founded by Plato, the Academy itself, the Lyceum of Aristotle, they were actually closed by Justinian because the argument was they taught pagan philosophy, and that wasn't true because, of course, Christianity is the truth. And so for quite a long period, really, between, let us say, the end of the 4th century of the Common Era, right up to the Renaissance, 14th, 15th centuries, there was an imposed orthodoxy on thought and inquiry. And the recovery of some aspects of the thinking of classical antiquity, in particular the lectures, the writings of Aristotle, were habilitated into church teaching, primarily by St. Thomas Aquinas, who did this tremendous job, actually, of effecting a kind of synthesis of Aristotelian and Christian theology. But if you contrast the outlook of the medieval mind, so for example, most of the art of the period, almost all of it, is devotional art. Resurrections, crucifixions, depositions from the cross, flagellations, annunciations, almost all devotional art. And compare that to Renaissance art. Landscapes, pictures of people having picnics, portraits of ordinary people, nudes, still lives, flowers, and so on. A very, very different view, a very different focus of interest. Similarly with literature. In the medieval period, those few who could read a great deal of what was called contemptus mundi, contempt of the world, because the world is a dark and dangerous place, a vale of tears. The devil and his minions are after your soul at every opportunity. But in the Renaissance, there came to be a celebration of life in this world, in this body now. The idea of romantic poetry and of songs, of music, a celebration of a very different focus. And that, I think, had a great influence, really, on eventually prizing the cold fingers of orthodoxy off the human brain. This is why people like Luther could challenge the imposed orthodoxy of the church. And as soon as that had happened, as soon as there was liberty of conscience in matters of religion, immediately there followed liberty of thought and inquiry in general. And that in the late 16th and during the 17th centuries was really important for getting the great scientific and philosophical revolution going.
And what lessons does the Enlightenment have for us today?
Well, the Enlightenment of the 18th century consisted in a broadened application of the new methods, the new styles of thinking that had been developed in the 17th century. If you think about the achievements of philosophers and scientists in the 17th century, think about Galileo and Newton, Gassendi, Huygens, Boyle, Roche, people like this, they were doing work in what we would now absolutely recognize as physics and chemistry in the case of Boyle, and modern thinking in philosophy about inquiry, about theory of knowledge. In the 18th century, you find people like Diderot, D'Alembert, and others generalizing this approach, this way of thinking, to much more than just physics, chemistry, and theory of knowledge, but applying it to the study of history, applying it to the other social sciences, applying it to thinking about human institutions, thinking about human rights and democracy arise out of this period, providing the kind of background, the sort of soil in which the seeds of revolution, the American and French revolutions, could really grow quickly and flourish. And so what happens in the 18th century Enlightenment is a generalization and a broadened application of these new ways of thinking that had been forged in the 17th century.
And what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, it happens that I'm just coming to the end of writing a book about war, as it happens. This was a few years ago. I wrote a book about friendship. Friendship being a concept in Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle had argued that friendship is the most achieved of human relationships. So if you can become friends with your parents when you grow up, become friends with your kids when they grow up, become friends with your lovers and spouses and so on, colleagues, this is success in human relationship. And so then I was asked by the publishers of that book, Yale University Press, if I would do a sort of companion volume. And I thought to myself, well, the opposite of friendship is enmity, and organized enmity is war. So I started to look into it. And of course, it's a really fascinating and important question. Why does war happen? Is war something that we are doomed to, or is it the result of misunderstandings on our part, how best to run societies and human relationships? And isn't it also the case, and I found to my interest actually, that just war theory, which is the account given of when it's okay to go to war or when you should go to war, and which has its roots in Christian thinking, as it happens, St. Augustine and then later on St. Thomas Aquinas. It came to occur to me that the reason that they turned their attention to it was this, that in its origins, Christianity is a pacifist religion. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, blessed are the peacemakers. And when it became the official religion of a great military empire, it had to look for a bit of wriggle room. It had to accommodate itself a bit to this new reality. And so it came up with a theory which has some things in it which are good and some things which are rather puzzling. And so I address the questions. Why war? What are the causes of war? What are the effects of war? And is there a viable just war theory that we could use sometimes to defend our going to war?
Professor Grayling, thank you so much.